Okay, well, I have 9 o'clock on my iPad, so I guess we'll get started. Welcome, everyone, to our special meeting for the Public Charter School Commission. This is an interesting meeting, humbling meeting, to say the least. Charles Hodges, he wrote a book that I read the other day, Systematic Theology was his book, and he talks about the principle of how public sin should be confessed publicly. So maybe we're involved in a little bit of what he announced in his book today. But we would like to begin with the commission work. We have the agenda before you, commissioners. Do we have any additions to the agenda, or do we have a motion for the agenda?
Mr. Chair, I would move to approve the agenda presented.
Okay, we have a motion to approve the agenda. Is there any further discussion? Oh, yeah, we do need a second. Thank you. Nothing like being a little nervous like this is your first meeting. Okay, we have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
Aye.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we've added something new to the agenda, folks, the public comment. You'll see this on at every meeting. So as a way to, Chelsea, there should be a way to shut that off when someone dings in. There's in my many conversations with the AG's office lately, in order to stay on the agenda and not stray in any of our conversations, we wanted to provide an opportunity for public input, so we didn't have that just conversation during the meeting, because sometimes we were getting off topic on the agenda as people came up and spoke. So we provided this part on the agenda for public comment. It's not a discussion with the commission. It's just for you, if you want us to address the commission, to have 3 minutes to provide any input that you want to give to us. We won't ask questions. We won't be in a discussion with you. It's just your time to share with us information. The commissioners won't engage in a conversation with you. We do have 3 letters that came in through email, and we will make sure that they're entered into the record. We will not read those here. The emails that come in will be entered into the record. And then if any of you have printed material that you want to give to us, we'll accept it at the time that you come forward. And so to start with, we'll go through the list that I have here, and then we'll check and see if there's anyone on the phone line that wants to be a part of this public comment time. So first on the list, Kelly Trudeau with Compass Charter. You're first that says yes. So if you just give us your name and who you're with, so we have it recorded for the record. We love these recordings, And
I'm glad you have a sense of humor after all of this. I understand. Kelly Trudeau. I'm with the Compass Public Charter School. So I was actually asked to read a letter by Scott, the administrator with North Idaho STEM. Is his email one of the ones that you have already in record? Or can I confirm that or not?
Let me see. We have
Scott Thompson, yes.
Scott Thompson. Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. In that case, I'll just make my own comments then. And I was more prepared to read his than mine, so this will just be a little bit more off the cuff. Compass Public Charter School is one of the very first charter schools approved by or authorized by the commission back in 2005. And since that time, I have seen a ton of growth and improvement in the commission staffers. We've all learned and grown a lot in those years. And, with one of those being the performance certificate and having a fair and measurable set of standards that all charter schools are held accountable to. earlier in our years as a charter, we were actually struggling. Financial issues were something that caused us to struggle, and we actually received a notice of defect from the commission. That was a very difficult time for us, and yes, we were frustrated, probably angry at the commission at the time. But we used that opportunity, the feedback that we received, and the opportunity to think out of the box and to make some changes in our own program to resolve that issue. Hindsight, obviously, I can look back and I can understand, and I know now that the commission was just doing their job. It wasn't personal. They made decisions based on what was best for students, what was best for and the Idaho taxpayers. And so I can look back at that now and appreciate that. I feel like the commission does a fantastic job. I know you have a difficult job, and having to be in a position where you have to make decisions about charter schools and hold them to those standards, and you know that there are students attached to that and parents attached to that and people who are employed attached to that, that's a very difficult decision to ever have to make, to think about, does this charter school need to be closed? Are they underperforming? How are they doing? I can only imagine. And the analogy that I would use is that as a charter administrator, I'm faced with that when it comes to underperforming teachers or students who are behaving in a way that's detrimental to our school. And by the time I'm taking those concerns to my school board, I'm probably pretty frustrated at that point, because it's not like I'm taking them to the school board and bringing those discussions up right when it happens. It's something I probably have been dealing with for a while. And I probably have given those individuals many opportunities to improve and to grow, and I'm not seeing that change or that growth. And so when I get into an executive session, sometimes emotions are what they are what they are. We are human. And that's obviously not the intent or the purpose of an executive session. However, we all make mistakes, and I feel like that's what this situation is. It was a mistake, but we all can learn and grow from those mistakes. And I feel very confident and support the Attorney General's decision. And thank you for the work that you do.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, is it Melanie Anderson?
Melissa. Good morning. My name is Melissa Anderson. I'm an administrator at North Star Charter School, and I'm not here to comment on the legality of past meetings. I am here to speak on behalf of myself. As a charter administrator, I am not afraid to speak out about my experiences with the commission. When our school switched from our local district to the commission a few years ago, it was a laborious process, but it really did lay the foundation for improvement for our school. Our first few annual performance reports weren't great, and the feedback and yearly visits did help our school improve. We didn't always like the comments, we didn't always like the feedback, but we did appreciate the opportunity for growth. Again, hindsight's 20/20, and there were times when we were upset, angry. What are we going to do? But we needed that feedback to get to where we are today. I want the commission to know that I am thankful for those standards and the reports that we get every year. I work hard to provide a safe environment for our students to receive an excellent education from our teachers, and I know that our families appreciate it too. The charters in our region recognize the importance of supporting each other, so we are successful. If the charter isn't doing well and isn't seeking help for improvement, they make us all look bad. So as the commission expects us to grow from our mistakes, I hope that you do too, and I do thank you for the job that you do. I know it's not an easy one.
Thank you. Tom LeClaire?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the commission. It's the open meeting law is a big deal in Idaho, and this is why. And you're going to learn all about that in your training. But again, it isn't. What's concerned us is with a coalition of Idaho charter school families and parents that support parental choice. It's the comments and the tone and the things that were said about charter schools that were unable to be there to defend themselves. in a closed session. And so it's serious trust has been damaged for this stakeholder. We like you people. We want to support you. But those sorts of comments that were made about charter schools that are struggling and the children in them are doomed, and 48% of charter schools aren't meeting a performance standard. It's the whole thing, when you come away from it, is pretty spooky when you're involved with a charter school that's under your scrutiny. And are they going to be treated fairly? Are they going to have a chance to turn things around like some of our charter schools we just heard have? So we hope that moving forward, things can be done to repair the damage, and we appreciate your efforts to do that. And we know it's going to be a long haul. But the culture of more standards and more aggressive approach to noticing and communicating and harassing almost these schools that are having some troubles, we hope it changes. We hope there's something positive that comes out of this, and that we see that we have a climate that doesn't see parental choice as a threat, that doesn't see charter schools that might be different from the norm as a threat, that the innovation and the flexibility and the various public school options that charter schools offer can be maintained and supported. And so those are the main things we're concerned about going forward. We hope that the trust can be rebuilt. We think it's been natural for this commission and the staff to see NACSA as a guiding light. And the National Association of Authorizers, we think, is a light at the end of a tunnel and a train coming the other way. And so we hope you can see that. We hope we can develop an Idaho answer to all this that isn't national, that isn't one size fits all, because one size fits all authorizing is not what charter schools are all about. This isn't the EPA or the Attorney General's Office of the United States. It's Idaho charter schools. We want to see, thank you, we want to see an air of support and encouragement. And what we heard in that meeting was not that. We hope it changes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Tom. Monty Pittman.
Good morning. My name is Monty Pittman from the Idaho Technical Career Academy. I know this is a special meeting to discuss open meeting law violation, but to us, this isn't a public meeting violation opportunity. What we're concerned about is what's been expressed as a violation of trust. Having listened to the recording, I was disconcerted about the flagrant inaccuracies about my school that were shared with the commissioners, and I'm prepared to speak to any of you anytime about the inaccuracies that were shared and provide information contrary to what you heard. To us, it indicates that you guys were uninformed about our school. All schools in Idaho, charters included, are required to meet the same educational standards under the state ESA plan. If that is the case, why does the commission add another layer of the same measures? Last year, the State Department of Education released a list of lowest 5% of schools in Idaho, and our school wasn't on that list. It appears that the comments in the meeting are designed to leave the commissioners with an inaccurate perception of our school. We feel there is an inherent and strongly held bias against our school that cannot be fixed by training, and we believe the school will never receive a fair and honest treatment at this point. I do want to make an additional comment. I am the administrator for a virtual school. You also have a lot of administrators from standard brick and mortar schools. We talk about brick and mortar schools having a lottery, which is a fair and equal opportunity for all students to enroll in school, which it is. But a little bit about our school. I've been a virtual school administrator for 11 years. I've held meetings for students to get extra help in homework in our school because they were falling behind, and had parents tell me that they don't have the gas money to drive to my school to get help for their students. So we needed to pull money to help get the student there so they could get that assistance. I have parents tell me every year that it's hard for them to supervise their students' schoolwork because it's a single mom working 2 jobs just to support the family. Now, I'm not intending to say anything against any other school. I'm just expressing what I work with every day in helping our students be successful. So when you're comparing the comments from my school, which is a virtual school, which has a high population of at-risk students, to traditional brick and mortar schools that do have a lottery, which is fair to all students, keep in mind that there are students in Idaho that cannot take advantage of that fair lottery. So, thank you all.
Thank you. Kelly Edgington?
Hello, I'm Kelly Edgington. I'm the head of school for Idaho Virtual Academy. I just want to tell you that listening to that recording reinforced my suspicions that incorrect and biased information is being presented to the commissioners by the staff. IDVA had a pre-renewal site visit led by commission staff a couple of years ago. The resulting report was not representative of the actual conversations we had when we were together. It was full of subjectivity and assumptions. I spent hours responding to that report, and I submitted it. I have little confidence it was thoroughly reviewed by commissioners. My concern was that staff would present to the commissioners the picture to the commissioners, and that recording reinforced that to me. Any trust I had in being treated fairly was already shaky, and after listening to the recording, that trust is zero. I have to give a couple of examples. When speaking about IDVA, Director Basinger said our condition was targeted at general education students, that is, their non-alternative students. She went on to say, we wanted to limit the condition to, how are you doing with just the non-alternative kids? I want you to know we do have a state-approved alternative school. It's grades 9 through 12. So in our condition, those grades are K through 8. So it goes on, it says general education students in grades K-8. The condition goes on to define general education as students not enrolled in IDVA's alternative program. Okay, they wouldn't be because they're K-8. The condition is all students, special ed, general ed. It's not, special ed is included in that too. At the time of the renewal condition, we had no alternative students, so I made that, sorry. Director Basinger makes it sound as if only students who are not at risk will be monitored for the condition. I want to make it clear that we have many, many students in grades K through 8 who are at risk for one reason or another, who do count into the condition. We'll be adding a middle school to our alternative school, so those will be separated out. This year, we've gotten that approved. But we still have many students who aren't in the alternative school that are at risk. They have, we could talk, okay? I also want to have one more comment. Director Basinger said about our demographics. They don't look terribly different than the state was said in that recording. Our low-income population has ranged between 50 and 65% over the last several years. Our students with disabilities, 13 to 15% over the last several years. That's above state averages, well above state averages. We also have highly mobile population. Half our students are new every year. They're coming to us for a reason. We have a full student support services team who works with these students and families with great, great social emotional needs. They aren't all in the alternative school either. The academic framework is weighted toward ISAT scores. I'll be really quick. I just want to make one more point. I was very pleased to hear Commissioner Bear say twice during the meeting that, not this is not a quote, this is my quote, a test score is not what determines a school's worth. Commissioner Bear said, I guarantee that the parent didn't take the child of that traditional school and put them into a charter school because of an ISAT score, because of anybody's ISAT score. They took their child out of the traditional school and put them in a charter school because of the environment, because of something we cannot quantify. Commissioner Bear, you're absolutely correct, and I thank you for having those sentiments. In conclusion, I have no trust in my school being treated fairly by this commission, and I hope that can be changed.
Thank you. Kathleen Allison?
Thank you, Chairman Reed and members of the commission. My name is Kathleen Allison. I'm the Executive Director of I Succeed Virtual High School. I want to apologize now. I've got a lot of chicken scratch. Just found out about this meeting, so wanted to pull together some things. I'm speaking on behalf of my board and myself in regards to the recording, but also in regards to information talked about my school during that recording. Myself and the board were very disappointed and shocked that a discussion about our data for our school was provided no context, despite the information, appeals, input on the annual reports, data, demographic information that's available on our school. My board went through the renewal process. It was very problematic a couple of years ago, in which my board was very disappointed in the report and what they felt was mischaracterization of their comments. But this is a historical distrust that has happened. And for us, that discussion of my data and our school's data, not having that context was really, really important because of the conditions that were placed on our school that we feel are inappropriate. And it's not just about my school, it's about all schools who are serving a high at-risk population. The data that we have through the state is pretty limited, as you guys know, but trying to put a condition on a school that is not matched to their demographics or what those students represent or their situation or the mission of the school is inappropriate. Simply put, 10th grade ISAT for a high school where we're serving 9, 10, 11, 12th grade, and the large population of our students are older than that, is not a reflection of our academic performance for our school. For-year cohort grad rate, one of the things I want to clarify, because that clarification was not given to the commissioners, is that the graduation rate is not a true graduation rate of the school. It is a measurement of how the students graduate within 4 years. So for my school and all other schools, especially schools who have alternative students, the last school attended is the school that gets the accountability for that graduation rate. So that's not our measurement of how we as a school are graduating students. So having that as a condition of our charter, again, is inappropriate. In Charter Commission meetings, when talking about data, especially for schools with at-risk population, our data described by the staff and the commissioners has been problematic. And so you guys know this is an issue. Now is the time to fix the issue. As commissioners, I urge you, you have the power to reject measures that do not match school demographics. Commissioners should do as other states have done and find meaningful, fair measures for schools serving those at-risk populations. Thank you.
Thank you. Carrie, help me with your last name. I should remember it, but I don't, Carrie, I'm sorry.
Kerry Wysocki.
Yeah, thank you.
Good morning. My name is Kerry Wysocki, and I'm the board chair for ITCA. You've heard from Monty and Kelly and some others about the main issues that we feel are trust. After listening to the board meeting that we believe was in April, there was a lot of elements there that were misrepresented by schools or for schools. As a board, we've gone through the Charter Commission, the Approval Commission. I agree completely with Monty and Kelly when they were talking about going through the process and information not being transmitted properly, either back to our school or we believe to you as a Charter Commission. So our main issue of this whole element is the trust that we have right now with the Charter Commission and the Charter Commission staff. Something has to happen to fix that riff, and I hope we can work it out. Okay,
Thank you very much. Susie Budge?
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Suzanne Budge. I'm here on behalf of a number of charter schools, but specifically registered as a lobbyist, as I have been for many years, for K-12, who represents the virtual schools that you've heard from today. But I have to say to you that I have represented charter schools for that many years, and including the brick and mortar schools. I was involved in 2003 when the original commission was founded, and unlike others in this room, can speak to the historic background and intent of the commission. And I would love to share that with you. And I have to say just fundamentally that the commission has strayed very, very far from its original mission, as intended by those of us who were here. And there's at least 2 of us in the room that were here at the time. For that, I have a very difficult time reconciling what I have heard on the tape. And many of you I consider friends. I've known you personally and professionally. And quite honestly, I defended you. I defended you to others who felt like they were embattled. And then I listened to the tape. And then I listened to it again. And it's really not about the open meeting law violation, although I'm pleased to see Mr. Kane here, and I'm pleased to see Matt Freeman here. As the press has so recently referred, that's where the accountability lies. And I have a very difficult time reconciling what you're going to hear from some of the people that come behind me, I know, because I've seen what they've written, and some of the people that came before me in their view of the commission. I can't reconcile that. All I can say is that I know schools have experienced otherwise, and you yourself know that, Mr. Commissioner. You did that survey a couple of years ago where you took direct information from the schools, and many of them expressed the sentiment that I think you should be familiar with already. And so I have to say it's really with a heavy heart that I come saying, as a person who was involved in creating the commission as a structure to give schools best practices and to give struggling schools support and to give schools other authorizers as an option, because school districts just simply didn't authorize charter schools. That's why you're here. It couldn't have ended up further from what I think our original objective is. And although I think all of you are good people and struggle to do the right thing, the commission is far afield from their original intent. I understand why, reading some of the NACSA leadership information that I've recently reviewed, and their reference to how the role of the staff is to overcome people like me who represent schools that take safety net kids, that EMO lobbyists are the part of the problem. The ability to lobby legislators and others and work around the political system is part of the problem that has been identified in the presentations that Ms. Basinger has made to others. And, it really gets at the fundamental, the fundamental role that advocates play. And I've always endeavored to put students and teachers and administrators before you rather than me. And I'd rather not be here myself today. But I find myself believing that almost everything that comes through your staff has been filtered and manipulated, and that's just not fair to these schools. You've heard from people other than me that kids are not necessarily going to go back into the traditional system if they fail here. There are zillions of stories from these administrators who will tell you this is the last stop for many of these kids. And this isn't why these schools were started. We weren't started to be safety net schools, but that's what they've become. They're not attempting to escape accountability, as has often been charged by some in the room and by your staff. And I hate to say some of you as commissioners, that's really not it at all. But we would love to have accountability from people who understood the credentials required to do fair accountability, as is true with the other schools, as well as have those credentials and have walked in the shoes of these administrators. And you simply don't have that resource available to you. So I believe that charter schools should not be better. They should not be brighter. They should not only have the smart kids. They really are all about choice. And if a parent thinks that one of these schools is a better option than the school they were in for 1,000 reasons, then that choice should be available to them. I'm sure I've exceeded my 3 minutes. I haven't even used my notes, Mr. Chairman, but I do appreciate you giving me this time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Teresa Molitor.
Ditto to everything that Susie just said. Good morning. My name is Teresa Molitor, and I'm a registered lobbyist for the Association of Charter School Leaders. I'm also a former board member of Heritage Academy in Jerome. A few days ago, you were all found guilty of violating the state's open meeting law. Anyone who has listened to the recording, and I think we all have, would agree that your conversation was inappropriate for executive session. But what about the conversations you've had in public, in regular meetings? Those have been almost as inappropriate and offensive. I can remember back in 2013 when I and others from the Heritage Board were called before this commission for questioning. I had heard that these commission meetings had become emotionally devastating, that people would leave them crying. But until I witnessed it firsthand, I didn't know what had been going on in the 9 years since our lobbying efforts created this commission back in 2004. The shift that had taken place was saddening and very disturbing. The other board members and I were treated like criminals. We were interrogated about broken playground equipment, alleged bullying, and of course, test scores. No matter what answer we provided, commissioners and staff acted as though we had done the most egregious thing, opening this charter school in Jerome. It was like we were embarrassing to the commissioners and the commission staff. Because Heritage wasn't wildly outperforming the traditional public school in Jerome, we were targeted, and Heritage has been on your hit list ever since. The recording of your executive session, frankly, seemed almost like an extension of the conversation you have boldly had in public for many years. Those public meetings, even as recently as the last one you conducted in June, show a real disdain and disregard for those who are passionate about providing education choice in Idaho. And what about that word choice? When we lobbied for charter schools in 2004, we talked about choice, choice, and choice. Never ever was a promise made that charter schools would outperform traditional schools. The mantra was, charter schools will do as well or better than traditional schools, and they will do it with less money and more innovation. Let me say that again. Charter schools will do as well or better than traditional schools, and they will do it with less money and more innovation. You see, this recording is not just a violation of the open meeting law. It's a violation of your original mission, which was to support Idaho charter schools, especially those that are struggling. Not excluding those that are struggling, but especially those that are struggling. Charter schools wanted more freedom and more flexibility to innovate, and were willing to trade away some funding to get it. But guess what? Charter schools are still giving away the money, but getting the opposite. They're saddled with more reporting, more accountability, more busy work. The Association of Charter School Leaders was formed to help policymakers remember what the original mission was. It wasn't for more money to duplicate high-performing schools. It was for more freedom and flexibility. That's why Idaho agreed to do this experiment called charter schools. It was simply to provide choice. Your job as commissioners was to support schools that were providing choice, whether they were virtual, brick and mortar, or something else. The recording I heard really wasn't that surprising. I've heard the same disdain and condescension from you and your staff for many years. This meeting today may cure your open meeting violation, but it won't cure the severe problems I just described. It won't cure the fact that you're completely misguided in what your mission is, or that you think this will all blow over if you just offer enough apologies. Thank you.
Thank you. David, hi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. My name is David High. I am the board chairman of Idaho Connects Online charter school, ICON. Before my retirement, I worked with Brian Kane, and he is a very fine attorney, and you are in very good hands. Brian will make you all experts in the open meeting law. However, I would like to briefly address two criticisms of the commission and its staff that were reported in newspaper opinion pieces. And first, there was a general criticism of the use of performance measures, arguing in essence that parents know what is best for their kids, and parental choice should eliminate the need for performance measures. And I think that is a sentiment among some of the charter schools, as you have heard. I could not disagree more. While performance measures need to match the demographics, which is always a very big challenge, those of us who have the privilege of offering programs paid for by Idaho taxpayers have a moral obligation to perform, not only for the taxpayers, but also for the children and for the parents who seek our help. The Commission's focus on performance is exactly where it should be. Second, there was a general criticism of the Commission and its staff. And again, I could not disagree more. Based upon the testimony today, it is clear that some schools have not had an experience such as I have had, and I can only speak for what my own experience has been. But we have worked with the Commission and its staff for 10 years now, and the Commission has always been fair and dedicated to the best interests of Idaho's kids. We have worked more with Tamara Basinger and Kirsten Pochop, and they are exceptionally good. Tamara and Kirsten are not only very talented and dedicated, but they are also collaborative in their approach. They always work with us to help us meet the goals established by the Commission and the state. They are very fine public employees. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I'm not sure the easiest way for those that are on the phone line. They unmuted? Okay. So is there anyone on the line that would like to participate in the public comment?
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, please.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, thank you. My name's Dan Cravens. I'm from Blackfoot, Idaho, and I'm a charter parent, and I serve on the board of a couple charter schools. First of all, I want to say something nice. We've been working with Jen Thompson from the Commission, and I just want to thank her. Jen has been very helpful, and we appreciate her, and I want to start off by saying something nice. Now, unfortunately, with that being said, I echo the concerns about trust. Our schools are very much an important part of our community and provide very important educational options. And one of the concerns I have as a board member, as a parent, and as a citizen of the state is there's very little interaction we have directly with commissioners. I can't remember, and I've been on one of the boards for a couple of years now, where we've actually had a commissioner visit us individually. And the reason I mention this is it's very good for commissioners, I believe, as public servants to go out and directly visit the schools and be independent fact finders. You can take someone's word for something, but until you actually firsthand, put yourself in that situation, experience that school, you don't really get the full picture. we're going to be doing, here before the school year, a couple open houses, and I would encourage any commission members, including yourself, Mr. Chairman, to come to our two charter schools down in Blackfoot and visit us and get a sense of why we're important and vital in our communities. I echo the concerns of trust. And the reason I say this is I listened to the recordings, and I won't belabor what was said on those recordings. And I appreciate the efforts to apologize and make amends on that. But once trust is lost, it's very hard to regain it. It's very hard. What I would encourage the commission to do is to sit back and take some time and develop a plan on how they plan to reestablish credibility. There's a lot of people upset about this, and frankly, understandably so. And develop a plan. I would encourage you to how you're going to move forward, how you're going to reestablish that trust, how you're going to create better communications with each individual charter school you authorize, and also how you plan to be independent fact finders. That you're going out and visiting these schools and engaging with these schools and discovering independently of staff, or as some people have mentioned, filtering what is going on in these individual schools. There's another point I want to make with regards, actually two more points I'd like to make with regards to the open meeting law violations that appeared to have occurred. We had a teacher at Bingham Academy, which is one of the charter schools I'm on the board of, who's got a father that has a very serious health issue going on. That was not a publicly known situation, and that was disclosed during the executive session, which was subsequently released. That was rather traumatic for that family and for that father, for that individual, that teacher, because that was not a public matter, and that had a personal toll. So I would encourage the commission to reach out to that particular teacher and her family and apologize for that. That's not appropriate. That's not appropriate discussion for an executive session either. The other thing that concerns me,
Hey, Dan, just
is that
so
Go
you know,
ahead.
your 3 minutes is up, so if you could kind of wrap it up.
I will try.
Okay.
The problem with going to law school is they never teach you how to be brief, Mr. Chairman. So I apologize.
Now, in the words of who is it? No try, only do.
Well, I try, and sometimes I fail. But is this the breaking of open meeting law? It sets a bad precedent for other commissions at the local level and the state level. I serve on a commission, and we don't conduct ourselves this way, and other commissions should not do that. The other thing that concerned me is you seemed all very comfortable in that session, and I strongly suspect, and I hate to say this, that might not have been your first time going outside the bounds of what should be covered in executive session. So I would be curious how you folks as a commission plan to police yourselves, since there's no way to have a recording or to know outside the group, your commission, what's going on in the executive session. So thank you for taking my comments. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Hey, Dan, this is Stacy. You can take my 3 minutes if you have more to say.
I appreciate that, Stacy. Stacy, you're quite elegant in your own words, so I think I've said what I had to say, but thank you. Thank you, commissioners.
Thank you. Okay, anyone else on the line?
Yes, my name is Melanie Fitzgerald, and I would like to speak.
Okay, please.
Okay, Mr. Commission and Committee, thank you for taking this time. Like I said, my name is Melanie Fitzgerald, and I live in Meridian, and I'm a parent of an Idaho charter school student. As an Idaho State certified teacher, I, along with my husband, chose to enroll our high-achieving student in Idaho Virtual Academy. We chose an educational environment that would be free from bullying, drug use, sex, things like that are rampant in our brick-and-mortar schools. Parental choice needs to be protected. A parent should be able to choose the environment and the school that their child attends for whatever reason. My student graduated at the age of 16 with a 4.2 GPA. She scored in the 90th percentile on the SAT and the 93rd percentile on the ACT in the nation. She was awarded $80,000 in academic scholarships from state in-state and out-of-state universities. He has decided to stay in Idaho and attend Northwest Nazarene University this fall. So my child is a virtual charter school success story, and it all is thanks to school choice. We were able to choose what school we wanted to go to and have her attend, and we found great success there, great support, and a very challenging academic curriculum. And we just hope that in the future the committee would choose to protect parental choice, and some of these charter schools that are underachieving, like Tom and Claire said, are not a threat to the rest of the charter schools. And as you can see, they serve not only extremely high achieving students, but also those that have no other options. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Yeah, this is Stacy Lilly. I'd like to say a few words.
Okay. Please give us your name again.
Stacy Lilia.
Could you spell your last name for us?
It's Lilya.
Thank you.
You ready?
Go ahead.
Okay, one thing I'd like to say that was real disturbing with the executive session was right at the beginning, you guys talked about modifying records, and that's why you couldn't shut these schools down. I'd like to know why you guys modified the documents after the November 15th deadline. I think my opinion is it was to show more issues with the schools and give you more power to shut them down. That's all I have.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Hi, my name is Jackie Collins.
Okay.
I am the executive director of Idaho Arts Charter School, but I'm also the vice chair on Mosaic's public school that is a charter school that is opening up in 2020. And so as Idaho Arts Charter School is not authorized by the commission, but the new public, Mosaic's public charter school that's going to open up in 2020 just received approval and authorization through the Charter School Commission. I know that this executive session was released and some things that were done in the executive session were, deemed illegal. But I think that with, further training that these things can be remedied. We need a strong commission. We need a commission that is going to make sure that the schools that are being authorized are quality schools, and the schools that continue to be open are quality schools that serve the needs of all students. And so, but without a commission, we wouldn't be where we are. And so, when the commission looks at certain schools and they have some, issues with things that they've done, and oftentimes it's along the line of finances and results, I think that their duty is to try to obviously fix those things, because we are only, all of us, as good as the school next to us. And so we all have to be held up and held accountable. That's just, a condition of being open. And my small amount of involvement with the commission thus far has been stellar. We had some pre-meetings before our charter went to go before the commission with Tamara, and I believe it was Jan, and I'm getting some feedback a little bit here, and it was, there was just so many great conversations about, our charter and what we wanted to do and things that we needed to fixing the charter, and so that then when we went before the commission, it was a super smooth presentation, and we're super excited to open. We are super excited to be authorized by the commission. We were quite quickly turned down and have received, a little bit of negative feedback from the local school district, and so without the commission, we wouldn't be able to do what we want to do with Mosaic's public charter schools. So I appreciate the commission. And I think that maybe, like I said, there has been some guidance from the Attorney General on some training, and I think that's the direction we need to go.
Okay, thank you.
I need to talk because I actually need to get to registration for my school. So my name is Jenny Ball, B-A-L-L. I'm a teacher at Bingham Academy. I just want to start with reflecting the frustrations with trust. If I had violated any laws, I would be under some severe scrutiny in my position. And I think that you should probably be under some scrutiny as well, not just training. You know very well that I would be researched, I would probably be audited 4 times, and I would probably be under a lot of question on whether or not I could maintain my job. And I don't trust this situation. I am in a position that I am developing the first medical assisting program in a high school that is the first STEM high school in Idaho, and I have not once heard that celebrated or enjoyed by anybody in the Charter Commission. Instead, we have been through the ringer on multiple things, and I heard it in the recordings where you guys violated some laws, and I feel like it's extremely unfortunate that we can just write this off as a mistake that we can train on, when in reality, a lot of us feel very, very much like if I violated a law, you couldn't trust me. And that's all I have to say.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Hi, I would like to speak.
Okay, please go ahead.
My name is Madigan Fitzgerald. I am the daughter of Melanie Fitzgerald, who just spoke to you about my attendance at Idaho Virtual Academy. I want to echo the words of my mother about the incredible importance of school choice. Because of school choice, I was able to choose a school that fits the way that I like to learn. By attending Idaho Virtual Academy, I was able to get that small school feel while learning from highly trained educators. At IDVA, I felt that my teachers had the time to give me individualized, one-on-one instruction. I was able to enjoy a public education without the exposure to cliques, bullying, and drug use that is often found in a typical brick-and-mortar school. Unlike many of my friends and family, I enjoyed my time in high school, and I strongly believe that other kids should have the opportunity to make their own choices and succeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan. Any others?
Yeah, I'd like to speak.
All right, please, go ahead.
My name is Ross Jones, and I really just listening to some of the comments that I heard from other schools. I think more than anything, and I have no prepared comments, I think more than anything, all of us are under the impression that the Charter School Commission was stellar. We liked working with them, and the help that was provided was pretty great. I think more than anything, that's why the recording is so startling and surprising, because all this time we felt as you do. You know, some of the schools that have spoken thus far, we felt like you. You know, this was an organization that we could trust, that we could come to, that we can get help from. And then to hear the recording, it surprised us, it startled us. I dare say that if all of the other schools, I think Compass Charter said something, you know, there's a couple other comments from a couple of other people, Idaho Connects Online. If your schools were mentioned in that meeting, they'd feel exactly like we do, surprised and disappointed. No one hates anybody here. We all want the same thing, I believe. But to hear the recording after working so closely with the commission for so long was a major hit and a major disappointment. So anyway, I understand how these schools feel, but as one that was mentioned in the recording, it's just startling. And I think if some of these other schools were in our shoes, they'd feel the same way. They just weren't mentioned in the recording. And that's it. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Any others?
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
I believe there might be one or two in the audience still that have not testified that maybe weren't signed up. Is it possible to be able to hear from any of them?
Okay, yes.
Good morning. My name is Terry Ryan, and I'm CEO.
We'll need to get that mic on, Terry.
Hey, I'm
Thank you.
Terry Ryan. I'm CEO of Bloom. I'm also the parent of two high school graduates, both graduated from Sage International Charter School, and both have gone off and are pursuing opportunities that I honestly don't think they would have had they not gone to that school. I listened to the tape. I found the tape hard to listen to, and that said, I'm not here to talk about that. I'm here to actually talk about what I've heard from a number of schools who have reached out to me, and you've heard of some of that today. This is almost like a Rorschach test. I've had schools that have called me up and they've said to me straight up, listen, Tamara saved us. She kept us going. I've had other people call up and tell me, you know, this is what you all have heard. So I just will reiterate what you've already heard. But I do want to take a minute just to put all this into context. And in the next couple of weeks, I'm going to five charter school facility grand openings. One is our friends at Compass. Another is Elevate in Caldwell. That's a school that's actually targeting the neediest student population, not only in Caldwell, but possibly the state of Idaho. You authorize them. You've taken a risk on them. I'd also like to tell you about Gym Prep Pocatello, which is a school that is actually taken over an old Sears building in a mall that was quickly losing business and dilapidated. I know the mayor's delighted that rather than a blight, there's going to be a school, and there's going to be children, and there's going to be family, and maybe there'll be new life in that mall as a result of you authorizing that school. Treasure Valley Classical Academy in Fruitland is a school that is in an old building that the district long ago said wasn't fit to be a school. They're now actually going to be opening at the end of this month, fully enrolled. All of these schools are fully enrolled and already have wait lists. And the final one is Forge in Middleton. It's a school based on the model at Sage. So these are schools that would not have opened. These are opportunities that would not exist were it not for the Public Charter School Commission and your work. Districts rejected every single one of them. So that's the context around which we operate. Finally, I'll just say there's 55 charter schools, 24,000 students. This is a big deal. And you guys have been a partner to our work. The State Board of Education has been a partner to our work. You guys know we received a federal grant on behalf of the state of Idaho. That grant is supporting many of these schools and many schools to come, schools that are hoping to expand. So this is a very tough conversation. And I just want to say, from the perspective of the schools, they understand, a number of them, that they could not do what they're doing without your support. Can you do it better? Yeah, I believe you can. And I'm always happy to give ideas and opinions if you want them. But this is important work, and I think I wrote something, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Anybody else? Okay, thank you. We appreciate the input. Our next item on the agenda is the consideration of the report and notice of alleged violations of the Idaho open meeting law and the opportunity to cure, and recommendations from the Office of the Attorney General. So just the background on this, the Office of the Attorney General did receive several complaints alleging that the Public Charter School Commission violated the Idaho's open meeting law during its regular meeting on April 11th, 2019. Upon investigation, the Office of the Attorney General concluded that probable cause exists for the Attorney General to bring a complaint against the Public Charter School Commission for violating that law. So the, excuse me, the Attorney General's report, which is included with your materials, Commissioners, cites 3 alleged violations of open meeting law and describes the Commission's opportunity to cure the alleged violations by taking the specific actions, including publicly acknowledging the violations, receiving training in open meeting law, and ensuring that any decisions stemming from the alleged conduct in violation of the open meetings law be set aside within a properly noticed and conducted meeting. The report further offers recommended best practices that the Commission may consider for adoption in order to enhance its compliance with the open meeting law. And the reason for this meeting right now, instead of waiting for our August meeting, is we needed to respond to this within 14 days.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, please, Commissioner Gordon.
Going back to the public forum, there was a letter in our packet that said, and the gentleman said, I would like to submit this letter for the August 1st special meeting. Please read at the meeting. Do we need to read this letter out loud?
Well, the letters that, most of them indicated that the letters that came in for public comment we're just going to submit into the
Okay,
into
just
the
because
record.
it said submit, even though he's listed on here. Please read at the meeting. Do we need to?
According to our information, it indicated that they'd just be part of the record. Becky? Pardon me? Yeah, so we'll just make it as part of the record of the meeting.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any discussion, Commissioners? Would entertain a motion if there's no discussion.
Mr. Chairman, I'll make a motion.
Okay, please.
I'll make a motion to accept the Office of Attorney General July 25th, 2019 report and notice of alleged violation of the Idaho open meeting law with the opportunity cure and adopt the cures as set forth in the report and notice accordingly. Number 1, the Commission acknowledges that the open meeting violations occurred during the April 11th, 2019 executive session. A, the agenda failed to identify the executive session as an action item, and B, the discussion during the executive session drifted into several topics for which the executive session is not provided and which were not identified in the motion for executive session. Number 2, the Commission will go through open meeting law training conducted by an Idaho Attorney General's Office representative. And number 3, although the Commission took no identifiable action nor made any decision during the April 11th executive session that must be set aside, to the extent that any discussion or sharing of information occurred that could impact future decision or action by the Commission, such discussion or exchange of information shall be disregarded in its entirety. And also, number 4, to adopt the recommended best practices to enhance the Commission's future compliance with the open meeting law as provided by the Office of Attorney General in its July 25th, 2019 report and notice of alleged violations of the Idaho open meeting laws with opportunity to cure.
Okay, is there a second?
Chairman Reed, I'd like to second that motion.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? Hearing none, so we have a motion and a second. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, motion passes. So the next item on our agenda is our training by Deputy Attorney General Brian Kane. That's your cue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Do you know if the PowerPoint is active today? I don't know if you want to take a quick break. This will be about an hour long, so I just want to, I don't know if anybody's coffee drinkers or what, but.
Okay, we'll take a 10-minute break.
The smoke is getting to me.
Just wanted a good disclaimer there.
Thank you, Brian.
We're gonna have to.
How are you? Yeah, are you good? Yeah. Okay, cool. I've had nothing to reshuffle my schedule, so I worked 16 hours, and I noticed that you were right there on Tuesday when I was in Middleton. I'm like, man, Sammy's already. Did you? God, I hate that. It's the same with like legislative meetings.
Are you ready?
Call her.
Got your armor on?
She's definitely like going in wide-eyed, but
I know.
it was. It's like such a good thing, like when there's such three good candidates, you know.
I
like,
know
it's
it.
such a hard choice to board. I was so tired. We worked like 16 hours that day. I'm like, oh god. It was so long.
Well, it was.
I think she's gonna
Good
be such a good
candidate.
one.
So I asked him.
Okay. Yep. Yeah. Okay.
I think so.
Yeah. I think that would be good. I probably won't stick around for the whole open meeting training, so, but you know, I wasn't. How you doing? Yeah,
Okay.
Yeah.
I was on the stroke yesterday and I talked to speaker last night. Just go take care of it. Oh, really? Okay.
They'll go public soon, so I'll share them with you.
What else do you see?
From resolutions? Oh man, I have one basically going against, Representative Richardson to share about Port Authority about programs. So I have one about that. I have one about rolling out the Vassar Educator Communities into a $60,000 tier.
So put that third tier back in.
Yeah, so phase those out. I have, let's see, a few like that have been kind of just went on excision. So allowing so when a community tries to excise themselves from a school district, just the community leaving votes, and it would then allow for the community who's impacted because their bond rating and like the taxes.
Okay.
So that one, I think that one's pretty easy. And like last year, it was sort of last minute. Cheney ran it, and then the House amended it, and so like it just got caught up in the last minute session drama, and it just never went anywhere. So, but I think the legislature likes the idea of it because if one community leaves and you don't get your say, you know, then it can impact the people who still live there.
Right.
Great. So. When I'm discussing sale of public property and executive session, which I get every year.
What is that?
Moscow. And they have a point. Like it gives an unfair advantage to especially rural. Like if you're trying to sell a piece of public property, if you have to discuss it, then they're only going to come to that amount. Like it makes it
yes,
competitive,
yes,
right?
yes.
But at the same time, it's like
Right.
so it's hard.
Right.
And then a few other ones that are pretty regular, like support strength, content standards, driver education reimbursement, which I'm going to share as well as last year. I got some of them out. One on K-12 funding formula principles. It's just like the kind of normal ones that come back around every now and then. There's a few other ones that I'm still waiting for. Nothing too. And then I think we do like this. I don't know how many there are total, but we have a few. IDEA, ICC, the GEM preps are all numbers. So there's a few, yeah. You know, we represent I think 56 total, do you know? I don't
Well,
know.
we authorized.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there are 68.
But some of them, like the one going in Idaho Park.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So.
What one is that one?
It's brand new. It's Highland Park Charter.
All right, so 8:45 at drop. Okay, cool. Thanks, Sammy. Thank you. Oh, thank you.
Mr. Kane, are you ready?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you for being here. Sorry that we had to do this to you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for the invitation, and I thank you for so quickly resolving this. And I will tell you that I have done this a number of times, and I know the difficulty with which it is to admit that you've done something wrong, that you've made a mistake. And I think that that difficulty is doubly true when you're in a position of trust, such as government. And so I understand what it means for you to be willing to come forth and to admit those your missteps and to want to correct them quickly. And so thank you for that effort. And I think that this is part of the entire process of building confidence within government and trust within government, and it's important. And I know that one of the issues that we as a nation are grappling with is confidence and trust in government. I also do ethics in government training around the state. And one of the charts that I use is a chart that shows the American trust in government from about 1955 to the present. And if you were to look at that chart, the chart is not good news. It's been going, at one point in time in the 50s and 60s, we had about 75% trust in government. At the current present time, our trust in government hovers right around the 18% mark. We had a little spike in 2001, but that was based on September 11th, and we just have never been able to recover it. And so I want you to know that your action today is part of that, the ability for us in government to repair trust in government. And the open meeting law is one of those tools that we use to allow folks to have confidence in what we do. And so with that, I want to make sure that everyone knows the manuals that you have are the most recent version of the manuals. They were just updated last month, and so if you want a hot off the presses, that is what these are at this point in time. When we get into the open meeting law, I like to start out with the kind of preamble of the open meeting law, and that is, it's the policy of the state that the formation of public policy is public business and shall not be conducted in secret. And I always like to start here for a couple of reasons. First is confidence in government. Second is one of the primary functions of the open meeting law and the public records law, for that matter, is that it allows for citizen oversight of what we do within government. And I think that the process that we're going through today is a direct reflection of that citizen and constituent oversight of government. And so, I mean, yes, this is a little bit painful and perhaps humbling for some of you, but this is also a sign that these mechanisms that have been put in place by the legislature are working, right? It's functioning. And so, yeah, we're on maybe the negative side of it, but it also shows that the system and the statutes and the law are working the way that they were intended to. This also leads to what I like to call kind of the default conclusion of the Idaho open meeting law. And my default conclusion for the Idaho open meeting law is that if you're ever in doubt, if you ever have a question about whether or not something should be in an open meeting, the answer is yes, have it in an open meeting, right? All benefits of any doubt go towards having whatever the discussion is within an open meeting. And I think that that is one of those things that if you use that as a cautionary point, you should always come out on the right side of the law. As we go through this presentation, I'll go through some definitions, the notice and agenda provisions, some conduct of the meeting issues. We'll dive fairly deeply into executive sessions, and then I'll go through the enforcement mechanisms. Since we're dealing with statutes, I always like to let folks know that when you deal with a statute, the definitions within the statute control. And so if the legislature has created a definition, that's the definition that you have to use. You can't say, oh, you know what, my understanding of this is X, Y, or Z, because The words within that statute are the definition. I like to use the example, if the legislature came out with a definition that said, if it waddles, quacks, swims, flies, it's a dog, then for our purposes, that will be a dog, even though in our minds, we are thinking that's not a dog, it's a duck. And so I always like that's a little bit of overkill on that example, but it lets you know kind of the importance of a statutory definition and statutory rules of construction. So when we come to open meetings really kind of center around two definitions. One is a decision, which is any determination, vote, or final disposition upon a motion, resolution, order on which a vote of a governing body is required at any meeting where a quorum is present. And so if you're going to have a vote on something with a quorum of the body, that should be done in an open meeting. Now, that definition seems fairly narrow, but it's broadened by the very next definition, which is deliberation. And that's the receipt or exchange of information or opinion relating to a decision, but doesn't include informal or impromptu discussions of a general nature. And so I like to think of this as if you are having a discussion that puts you on the road to a decision, then that discussion should take place in an open meeting. And so if you start talking about a topic and you can see that in the future there's a decision on your horizon, then that discussion needs to take place within an open meeting. And you can really start to understand at that point how broad those two definitions become when you put them together. Public agency, I'm not going to go through the definitions of public agency because you are all clearly a public agency that fits within this definition. But I do want to turn your attention to 4 lines from the bottom, which says any sub-agency of a public agency created by or pursuant to statute or executive order, ordinance, or other legislative act. And I call that to your attention because if the commission decides to start creating subcommittees to do its work or to do portions of work, those subcommittees very likely have to comply with the open meeting law. And I always like to point that out because we get a lot of questions within our office about subcommittee work. And so the answer is if you decide to create subcommittees, make sure they comply with the open meeting law. A governing body is members of any public agency consisting of 2 or more members with the authority to make decisions for or recommendations to a public agency. Again, you can see where that sub-agency definition works in with that governing body definition to say subcommittees need to comply with the open meeting law. And then there are 2 types of meetings. Those are the convening, regular and special. And a meeting is just the convening of a governing body of a public agency to make a decision or to deliberate toward a decision on any matter. And if you look at that definition, it builds in all of the previous definitions that we just went through. Out of this, we often get a few different questions. Probably the number one question that we get as an office is, can we as a commission or board go to lunch together? Has anybody ever wondered that? And the answer to that is yes, you absolutely can go to lunch together, but there's a caveat, right? The caveat is you can go to lunch together as long as you don't talk shop. And so I always like to put it to folks this way. It's not whether you can go to lunch together. The question is, can you go to lunch together and have the self-discipline to not talk commission or board business? And I always like to let you know that we're all humans. And so if I go to a social event or a lunch or something else, and I'm just going to pick on Becky for a second here because she's from my office and right in front of me. But if Becky and I were to go to lunch, I'm fairly certain that our conversation would start out in a very similar fashion to many other conversations. How's your summer going? Have you gone anywhere exciting? We're going to go through kind of all of those, what I call preliminaries. And then we're going to hit a natural pause point. And what do you think the very next topic that's going to come up after that pause point is? What are you working on? Any interesting cases? And to me, that's why I like to liken this to a self-discipline question. Because if you go out to lunch, you're going to go through kind of the same process with your conversation. And when you get to that pause point, are you going to be able to say, hey, what'd you think of the ending in Avengers? Or are you going to launch into, I can't believe that those guys presented that stuff to our commission today. Or what did you think of that? Because that's where you get into danger. And so that's why this isn't really a legal question. It's a self-discipline question. And it applies, if you want to go to the funeral across town or share a lift to the airport, all of those contexts, it's absolutely acceptable for you to be in those situations. I will also note that Idaho is a relatively small state. And so one of the things to be aware of is that other folks are aware of what it is that you're doing. And so, for example, if you as a commission decided to have breakfast every Tuesday at Elmer's, people would notice that. And one of the conclusions that they're going to draw is that you're conducting board business, even if it's the most innocent breakfast on earth. So the appearance matters as well. And one of the things about our brains is that when we lack information on anything, we fill in the gaps, our information gaps, with negative inferences. Meaning, if I see you all around a table and you're in discussions and I can't hear what you're discussing, what's the very first conclusion I'm going to leap to? That you're talking about board business. And so I think that's one of those things to always be aware of, that our brain, when we don't have information, is going to fill in the gaps with negative inferences, right? It's actually part of the dilemma when you have very lengthy executive sessions, for example, right? If you have an executive session that goes for 2 hours, 2.5 hours, folks are going to immediately think there's no way they could have stayed on topic the whole time, right? And so you're putting yourself in a situation that may unnecessarily cause you to be cast in a negative light. And I think that's one of those things to always be aware of when you're functioning as a governmental entity. One of the things I forgot to say at the beginning is if you have questions, please feel free to ask them as we go through this. This isn't just a lecture. I mean, I think that this is a give and take sort of presentation. And I want you to know that the goal of the open meetings law is not to enforce, it's for compliance. The whole goal of the law is to encourage compliance. And one of the ways to get better compliance, is through you asking questions where things aren't clear, or maybe you're like, how can we do this better? So I want to make sure that you're aware of that aspect. So there is a new provision, and that is I'm ahead of myself. All right, got it. So with notice and agenda, for regular meetings, you have to provide at least 5 calendar day meeting notice and 48-hour agenda notice, unless provided otherwise by statute. And that's just because certain boards have more specific notice provisions than what's in the open meetings law. And then special meetings can't be held without at least 24-hour notice and agenda notice unless an emergency exists. And our office interprets an emergency to be like exigent circumstances, floodwaters rising, fire marching down the hill, that sort of emergency type circumstance. Under special meetings, the press can ask to be put on a list where they're notified of all special meetings, and you do have to comply with that. So a special meeting is any meeting that occurs outside of your regularly scheduled meetings. One of the exceptions on the notice is you can schedule all of your meetings out. So say as a commission, you say we meet on the second Wednesday of every month. You can publish that notice in January, and then you comply with the 48-hour agenda notice. Now, any meeting that occurs that isn't on one of those regularly scheduled dates, that would be a special meeting. Anytime you have a meeting that isn't according to whatever your schedule is or your calendar, those become special meetings. There is a newer provision in the law which requires that all notice for meetings and agenda be posted electronically if the entity maintains an online presence through a website or social media platform. And just so you know, I have checked, and I note that the commission has posted your notice, agenda, and minutes all online within your website. You are allowed to have an executive session only meeting. It requires at least 24 hours prior for the meeting and agenda notice, and it has to state the reason and specific provision of the law authorizing the executive session. And so you are allowed to have an executive session only. One thing to always remember with executive session only meetings is you're still going to have an open portion of that meeting because you're going to have to move into executive session. And so if the public wanted to come and observe you all making the motion and taking the vote to go into executive session, that portion would be open. The other thing I always like to remind folks about with executive sessions is it's not uncommon to have an executive session that then requires some action to be taken after the meeting. And if that's something that is likely or probable to happen, you want to make sure that that's on your agenda because you may have to come out of the executive session and take some action within that open session. An agenda is required for each meeting. It's posted the same as the meeting notice, which is at your principal place of business and online. You can make good faith amendments to the agenda. If you make amendments to the agenda outside of 48 hours, you just post the new agenda. If it's within the 48 hours, then you want to post a notice that the agenda has been amended and then adopt the amended agenda at the start of your meeting. And then after a meeting has started, you can amend the agenda at that point for good faith amendments, meaning something has occurred that says, hey, we have to change the agenda at this time and we didn't have notice of it 48 hours out or 24 hours out. So there is a process. You want to make sure that whatever the reason is for amending the agenda is reflected in your minutes. Again, because that's kind of the protection that you have when you amend the agenda.
So when we do approve the agenda, when the meeting starts, it would really have to be unusual for us to change or add to the agenda.
That is correct. I mean, that should be.
Right.
Yeah.
It would have to be,
So what would
what would it be?
Perhaps the board received information like on a personnel matter that it couldn't like wait another meeting cycle to address. You know, when I talk about, one of the examples I use is, you know, suppose you're a school district and you find out that one of your bus drivers has a substance abuse problem or something, right? You can't take the risk of perhaps sending that person back out there, you know, with that uncertainty. And so you as a board may need to take some sort of action right there and you just found out about it. That could be an instance.
So it's going to be unlikely that we would ever have that sort of
Yes.
need to amend the agenda.
Yes. I mean, the other thing that may happen is, you know, Idaho, our weather can be somewhat tricky, particularly in the winter, depending on what part of the state you're in. And so you may have to remove somebody from the agenda because they just can't get there or whatever. I mean, there those sorts of scenarios that are a little out of the ordinary and don't come up every meeting. I will tell you that if you're amending your agenda at every meeting, that's a cautionary flag, right? Hey, we need to look at how we're organizing our meeting and preparing.
Mr. Chairman, I have a question. Mr. Kane, so I know I've been in meetings where there are people and the agenda's set on a certain, you know, and they had to be moved up on the agenda. Would that be like an amendment to an agenda as to they have to leave for this reason? So could we put them earlier or
So,
something?
So I think I don't know that that's really an agenda amendment because they're already on the agenda. And so it's more of an organizational sort of thing. It's more, I think it's more if you're adding a discussion that hasn't already been indicated to the agenda, or if you're removing a discussion that maybe people showed up for. You want to make that amendment and make folks know, we're not going to discuss the siting of the Walmart because the Walmart representative's flight got canceled. And so we're sorry to the, 20 people that showed up to talk about that.
So, Mr. Chairman, it would be like if one of the charters that we're looking to approve would pull their charter just before the meeting in that 48-hour notice, that would then be a time for an amendment.
That's a good example.
True, yeah, thank you.
The agenda also is required to have all items of probable discussion. And I think that that's one of those things that's really important because there are some, every now and then I still come across an agenda that says old business, new business, and adjournment, and that does not meet the requirements. It should include each item that the commission intends to address annotated. And I looked at your agenda and it generally complies with that. I did point out one issue on the executive session, but generally you do have all of the probable items of discussion. I think the real key there is you want to stay focused within those items.
Mr. Chairman? Okay, sometimes I see a consent agenda. I'm not sure what that means.
So I think that one of the things I always remember is that the open meeting law only applies to how the meeting is handled for purposes of public observation and notice. Things like consent agendas and regular agendas and information agendas, those are kind of meeting organizational issues, and so they don't necessarily fall under the open meeting law, but if you use those tools, you have to use them in compliance. A consent agenda is simply those items for which there will be little or no discussion, meaning everybody is generally in agreement that, hey, we got to pay the bills every month. And so we're not going to debate them. There's no reason to pull out, bill X and say we're not going to pay it. So we anticipate that everyone will vote aye on it. That's why it's called a consent agenda item. Now, just because it's on the consent agenda, it doesn't mean that you can't remove it and place it into the regular agenda. And that would be done through a motion and a discussion. And that's an example, again, where you may amend an agenda within that 24-hour period or even after the meeting starts, right? You find out we're going to pay the cell phone bill and it's on the consent agenda, but then information comes to the commission or maybe to the attorney that somebody's misusing their cell phone and the bill is $500 instead of $200. Well, that's no longer something you may want to consent to. And so you may want to have a discussion and say, hey, we need to take a look at this and investigation and that sort of stuff. And so generally, you're all going to vote aye on consent agenda items. They should be identified as an action item. And the general practice is to approve the motion is to approve the consent agenda. I've seen boards and commissions handle that item by item. There's all sorts of ways to do it, but that's perfectly acceptable. The other thing that I always like to point out is that action items, anything that requires a vote, and I want to focus your attention on that portion of the statute. An agenda item that requires a vote shall be identified. And so if you're going to take a vote on it, which means if you're approving your minutes, your consent agenda, the motion, you have to make a motion and have a roll call vote to go into executive session. So those are all things that require you to identify them on your agenda as an action item. And I think that's one of those things just to kind of really keep an eye on is that requirement for action items. Final action can't be taken on an agenda item added after the start of a meeting unless an emergency is declared necessitating action at the meeting. The declaration and justification shall be reflected in the minutes. And so if you add an item to the agenda and it also requires that action be taken, you want to make sure that that is clearly indicated within your agenda why that's added and why you have to take action at that meeting. Again, you put that make sure that that gets into the minutes as far as your explanation. And again, I just want to kind of remind you that with executive sessions, oftentimes you have to come out of the executive session if you want to take action. And so you may want to have something on your agenda that says action may be taken if necessary on the executive session item. Something to let the public know that there is a chance that you will come out of the executive session and it's an action item.
So before you move on your first bullet, it's that kind of scenario where that last sentence, identifying an item as an action item, does not require a vote to be taken. That is, in executive session, you realize that, no, we're not actually going to, the person has already resigned, that we were going to have to take a vote on whether to retain or fire. So we
Right.
come out of executive session, we know the outcome already.
Yeah, so and that's exactly it. Just because you identify it, and that also enables you. Then, for example, let's use our Walmart example. Right, Walmart can't make it because Chicago is snowed in, and so you can't even take up that item. Well, it's identified as an action item. You don't have to take action on it, and so that just because you identify it, and it may be that you have a motion to table it for a meeting. That's also permissible. The key is you don't want to have it not identified as an action item and then realize at the meeting, we want to vote on this. And I'm sure that you've all had an experience where you've sat in a meeting and somebody has presented something perhaps on an information agenda and you said, well, can we just vote on this now? It's kind of an expedient. And part of that is we want to make sure that the public has notice of those items that when we in government are going to take action on so they can observe it.
So that's the question on our own agenda. So on your item on the agenda, we have action item. What would be the reason? We just covering our bases here?
Yeah, I don't have the agenda.
I can answer that, yes.
So we just put action item on all these.
I think so. I didn't see the agenda, but it may just be that they were thinking that if there was an additional step that needed to be taken with regard to our report and recommendations that came out of, for example, this presentation. I think that it was intended for that purpose. So I want, and just so you know, the action item has generated a lot of discussion across the state through a lot of different boards and commissions. And I can also let you know that within our office, right, we're an office, we have about 120 attorneys, and we've had some days of fairly spirited debate over action items and agendas. And so I want you to know that this is one of those things that it's new, there's some growing pains, and we are going to get it right, and that's why we're here. So when you conduct a meeting, you can conduct a meeting using telecommunications devices. You all are doing that today. There are a couple of caveats with telecommunications devices. Number one, you want to make sure that you have a board member or executive director in whatever room that is identified as the telecommunication device room or whatever. The law doesn't allow for kind of a science fiction room that's all black with a white speaker box in the middle of the room that people huddle around. So that's one of those things to always be aware of. We also get the question, could we have like a net meeting, like a go-to meeting? And the answer is yes, provided you've got somewhere where folks can come and watch that meeting occur. And so I think that's one of those things, as the technology evolves, it becomes very easy to have these kind of internet face-to-face meetings. And so just make sure that if you want to go that route, you have some way for folks to participate and observe. And nowadays, it's very easy to have like listen-only meetings and those sorts of things. During a meeting, you cannot use computers or text to conduct private conversations among yourselves about board business. That defeats the entire purpose of the open meeting law. And I want to give you a couple of cautions, if you don't mind, about kind of texting and using computers and devices during meetings. One, there is a public appearance element, right? The public has taken time out of their schedule to come to your meeting and observe you in action. And so if they never see the whites of your eyes, so to speak, because you're always looking at a screen, that's going to leave an impression on them as to whether or not they're being fully heard and whether or not you as a commission are fully engaged in the public's business. And so think about it in those terms. And then the other thing to always keep in mind is that there is no such thing as surreptitious texting. And I'll tell you why. Because number one, nobody stares down at their crotch for that long. And number two, nobody ever looks down at their crotch and starts laughing. And so I just want to always remind you that there is an appearance that is very obvious to folks when you do this stuff. And I actually, I think that one of the most positive steps that folks can probably take for meetings is to kind of make them device-free as much as possible, right? Of course, you're going to have that one day when your daughter is expecting or whatever, and you do want to get that information. But that really should be the exception as opposed to the rule. Give the public their time in front of you and engage with them. And I think that you'll find it a much more satisfying experience, particularly if you're in a situation where you're building or rebuilding trust within that environment. So take that. Yes?
So you said not to use electronic devices to communicate with each other during the meeting. So how does that fit with the legislature when half of them are on the phone talking to each other during the session?
So that's a very good question. The legislature is the legislature.
So they don't have to worry about an open meeting law.
Well, their meetings are governed by their rules. So each house has their own rules of proceeding, and that's what governs them within those contexts. But it's a good question. I just have an unsatisfactory answer. And I can't argue with you.
And my question is, I mean, if we have a 700, 800, 1,000 page packet, it's difficult or impossible to print everything. So
Sure.
the electronic device is how we're accessing our materials.
No, and I fully acknowledge that. And I think that, I mean, based on, what I see here, you're all engaged. I mean, the thing is, I think that you can all think to a meeting that you've attended where somebody is just so engrossed in whatever is on their device or whatever, or it's very clear that, they're streaming a Monday night football game. I mean, it's just one of those things to be cognizant of as a commission, right? You're here with a purpose. This is Attorney General Lawrence Wasden. He's here to correct all of my misstatements.
Not to give you a correction, but we're not saying don't use electronic devices. We're saying be cautious about how you use electronic devices. That's all.
Yeah.
Is the general perception understood that this is where our 700 page packet is, or is that something that could or should be acknowledged, or is it just, we just be judicious?
I think all of those are good answers. I think that if you want to say, that the commission members have all of the materials in electronic format to, save resources, you can say that. If you want to say, we're just going to be judicious, however you want to handle it. The whole key is, how do you create that connection with the folks that come before you? And our caution is that the devices can act as an obstacle to that connection. So,
May I add?
Okay,
Sure.
we've got, since we want everything recorded, would you turn on your mics so we can get everything on a recording?
I was struggling too, just as Sherilyn mentioned, because I know school boards are going to
a computerized version of it. And I do feel like we need to model that behavior you're discussing of being able to engage with people and not everyone looking down at their phone. So I appreciate that guidance because I think it really is beneficial for building those relationships that we want to all the way around, and that we're modeling the appropriate behavior for students and others.
Sure. As you conduct your meeting, you have to provide for the taking of written minutes of all meetings, and all minutes shall be available to the public within a reasonable time. One of the questions that we get all the time is, what's a reasonable time? And the answer to that is an answer that I, as a lawyer, love. It depends. If you're a board or a commission that has a professional staff and you meet regularly, those meeting minutes should be coming out fairly routinely. There shouldn't be a delay. If you're a weather modification district that meets once a quarter and have no staff, it may take you a little longer to get your minutes out. By the way, that's an actual government entity in Idaho, Weather Modification District. And the other thing I always like to remind folks of is that draft minutes are still public records. And so just because the board hasn't approved them, if they've been put down to paper or Word or whatever it is, that's a public record at that point. And so those should be released. Now, you may want to stamp them draft, subject to change or subject to board approval, but they still should go out. Minutes have to include all members of the governing body present, all motions, resolutions, orders, or ordinances proposed in their disposition, and the results of all votes. And so that's the bare minimum.
I have a question. So because the discussion from the executive session got recorded, does that automatically become public record at that point on what happened here?
So that's a good question. So yes and no. So it's a public record, but there may be portions of that should be redacted. Now, the way that this has unfolded, the entirety of it has been released, and so it is a public record, right? Because it's already all been out there. There are no reasonable efforts to preserve the confidentiality of the record. But if you make a recording and then it's still in existence when the request comes in, you may need to have someone listen to it to find out if there's information that should be redacted. And I think that that's one of those things, that's a public records question, but it's one that you want to think about what your procedure is for public records and how they're responded to and what your review process is prior to them going out. Does that answer your question?
Do we need to identify within the commission who has custody of or the main contact for public record requests?
Yes. That's a requirement within the public records laws that you should designate a custodian for all public records, and that way the public knows if I want records about the commission, I direct my request to this person. So now we are on to, one last thing about minutes. If you ever have a question as to how your minutes should look or if they're thorough enough, the best model that I can offer to you for minutes of meetings are legislative committee minutes. And if you go online and just read through those, you'll see that they're a great digest of those minutes. The other thing to keep in mind about minutes is that written minutes means in writing on paper. And you may wonder why I'm explaining to you if the statute says written minutes means in writing on paper. It's because our office went to the Idaho Supreme Court over the question of whether an audio recording was the same as written minutes. And the Idaho Supreme Court said, no, minutes are an encapsulated digest of what happened at the meeting. It's not an audio recording. Written means in writing. Things that only lawyers can fight about. So then we get to executive sessions. And an executive session at which members of the public can be excluded only for the purposes and only in the manner set forth within this statute. The motion has to identify the specific subsection that authorizes the executive session. There shall be a roll call vote on the motion, and the vote shall be recorded in the minutes. And an executive session shall be authorized by a 2/3 vote of the governing body. And so you've got some very specific requirements within there. I did note before I came in here, I looked again at your minutes, and they do say that you have a roll call vote. But my recommendation would be that you indicate each member's vote. That's the roll call vote. And so yes, even though it says roll call vote approved 6-0, my recommendation would be that, Commissioner Reed, aye. Commissioner Scigliano, aye. Whew, that was should have skipped right to Quinn. I should have gone right to Quinn. But my recommendation is that because it says roll call, I think you want to reflect exactly that roll call within your minutes. And so that's a recommendation that I kind of making on the fly on my way in here. We get a lot of executive session questions. One of the top questions that we get is who decides who gets to be in an executive session? And the answer is the commission gets to decide who is in the executive session. And so if you want to have an executive session that is only the commission with no staff, you have that ability. If you want to have an executive session that includes all of the staff, you have that ability. If you want to have an executive session that includes the commission and a specific representative from a specific charter school, you have that ability. The cautionary tale that I will give you about executive sessions is they are designed to protect confidence, right? There's some element that has to be discussed that should be kept from the public view. So does anybody know what Ben Franklin said about the best way to keep a secret among 3 people?
I don't know. I got my own answer, but I don't know what he said.
Well, I want to know if you're willing to share it, I'd like to hear the answer. It might be right.
I've learned not to say anything in public now.
So what you can tell me if you were right. What Ben Franklin said, the best way to keep a secret among 3 people is if 2 of them are dead. And so I think that when I think about executive sessions, one of the cautionary elements is the more people you bring into that executive session, the more difficult it is going to be to preserve whatever confidence it is that's discussed within that executive session. And then that also crosses over to how long your executive session is. As you expand your executive session, 2 things occur. Number one, it becomes much more difficult to remain on the topic of whatever the executive session is. And then number 2, the more far-ranging your conversation goes within that executive session, the more difficult it becomes for you to keep all of the discussion within that executive session privileged. And so I think you always want to keep those 2 things in mind with executive session, right? They should be limited in the number of attendees, and they should be limited in the amount of time spent within the session. And those are things that you always want to be aware of. Now, when we go through executive sessions, one of the things that I always like to have folks focus on is that for every one of the exceptions, you should be able to identify a specific person, place, document that is being discussed. If the answer is ever something general, then that's a caution that you probably should not be going into executive session. And a great example is this very first one in A. When in hiring a public officer or employee, staff member, the respective qualities of individuals are to be evaluated to fill a particular vacancy. So what that tells me is you should have 2 specifics. We are considering person A for position B. That's how specific it should be. It shouldn't be, we have a couple of vacancies, how are we going to fill them? It should be, we've got these candidates. What do we think of these candidates for the position of X? And the same analysis applies to the very next exception, the evaluation, dismissal, or disciplining of or complaints, charges against a public officer, employee, staff member, individual agent, or public student. And so again, you should be able to identify the evaluation, the complaint, whatever that is that you're thinking about, and the person against who it is. And so it's that specific. So you're never in there for anything general. People are generally dissatisfied with the way things are going. That's not an executive session topic. It's, I have a complaint against the executive director. Okay, let's talk about that. That's how specific it should be. Same things as you go down. Under D, you should have the actual record that you can identify when you go into executive session, and be able to say, this is the record that we're considering. You don't have to disclose the record, but for example, if you get challenged and you wind up in court, you want to be able to say to the judge, here's the record we were considering, and it was exempt under this provision.
So, for example, we would need to identify, we're considering student test results of school A in building B in classroom C that only has 5 kids. So it is potentially student identifiable.
So you don't have to go to that level of detail. You could simply say, we're considering student data, which is exempt under Public Records 74-104-1, I
Okay.
think.
Thank you.
And I think, and that should do it, right? So you're in under D, and the records are exempt under 74-104 sub 1. You can go into executive session to communicate with legal counsel, to discuss legal ramifications and legal options for pending litigation or controversies not yet litigated but imminently likely. And so here, you have to either have a case that's already been filed or a case that is reasonably certain to be filed. This is likely to result in litigation. We need to talk about how the board is going to address this. Just having your attorney in the executive session doesn't satisfy the requirement, right? It can't just be, oh, our attorney's here, therefore we're in executive session. And I think that that's one of those things. You should be able to say, this is the case we're discussing, or this is the case that could be filed.
Brian, can I back up a little bit and
Yeah.
follow up on Commissioner Bear's question concerning
Sure.
the student data? So the data that we reviewed in our April meeting, who designated that as confidential? I don't know who can answer it, but.
So it is the State Department of Education that makes the judgment on what student data can and can't be released. We try to match our confidentiality to their determinations.
So did they say it was confidential? Or did we say it was confidential?
We did subsequent to their direction, if that makes sense.
Okay. So are we free to make that determination of what's confidential and what isn't as far as student data is concerned? Would that be your opinion?
So I think that there are statutes that identify what data is confidential and what isn't. And so the question is, would the data that you're considering meet the definition of those statutes? And so in I think it's Title 33, Chapter 5, there's certain data that's exempt from disclosure. And then there's also additional data that's exempt from disclosure under the Federal Educational Right to Privacy Act. Got it. And so I think that the question is, does the data fall under one of those two sets of statutes? And if the answer is yes, then it's you treat it as confidential and you go in under subsection D. If the answer to that is no, then you probably shouldn't be going in under subsection D. You may have a different section that you could go under, but it's going to be the statute that defines whether or not the data is confidential.
So are we in trouble if we talk about data and it should have been confidential? And we didn't really? Are we up
You
for
could
crick either way?
You could be.
I have a question on that too. If the majority of the data is not exempt, but there's only one or two items of the data that is exempt, should we pull those out separate? Or, yeah, that's kind of a gray area in my mind.
Yeah, and I think that that's one where the commission may want to sit down and have a little bit more robust discussion with the executive director and your assigned attorney, because it may be a situation where your executive session becomes a lot more narrow, right? Because you've only got these kind of 3 data points to discuss as opposed to all of the data points. And I think that that's part of the evaluation of what discussion needs to occur within the executive session and what discussion needs to occur in the open session. And I think that if you gray it, you wind up with an executive session that maybe encompasses more than needs to be within the executive session.
Mr. Chairman,
Yeah.
so given the scope of our responsibility and the importance of this, is there a chance that at some point we could do an information or an education session and help us understand better what legally is confidential and what is not? I understand numbers of students in subgroups in general, but I don't understand that well enough.
Yeah, I wrote that down as something that we've got to clarify and understand as a commission, because truthfully, I went back through all that data and I couldn't identify individual students. But that's why I was curious where the statute, what designated that.
Yeah, and I think.
So we're kind of, darn if you do, darn if you don't.
And I think that that's an accurate assessment, right? You've got a needle that you've got a thread, and it's a little bit tricky of one at that. And it may be that, that's a discussion that should be had between members of the commission, maybe your attorney, and some folks from the state board.
Okay. Thank you.
And just one point, if there ever is question about legality of student data, I am always happy to review that so that we can ensure that.
I have a question on that too.
Doing that ahead of us.
Yeah.
You should keep us out of trouble ahead of that.
No, absolutely, but I need to know the information in order for me to give you the legal guidance. I need the question to be asked of me to be giving you legal guidance. Does that make sense?
I just ask it for all the time. Right?
One question that I had too was, as you're looking at student level data, and and you're also connecting it to data that's out there in the public that's available while you're in executive session. I've kind of failed to see if we can't reference that and we can't talk about that along with the privacy data, and maybe they're connected somehow. So how do you have that discussion, Brian?
So I think that's a good question, and I think that the key is, as long as you're discussing the confidential data and that it's reference to public data, you're still okay. It's when the discussion migrates to a discussion of just the public data, right? And you lose that connectivity to the confidential data. And that's where you really want to be careful, because once that discussion migrates, it's out of the box at that point. And it's very hard to get back to that confidential purpose. And one of the things that you always want to make sure of that you have within your board or commission are folks that can speak up and say, hey, we're getting off into an area where we can't have this discussion in executive session. And I think that it's, to me, it's one thing to say, yes, we want folks to speak up, But the real test is, do you create a culture within your board that empowers and enables folks to speak up in that circumstance? And those two concepts don't always match up organizationally. And so I think that, to me, one of the takeaways for this commission from this exercise is, are we going to have a culture that empowers us to say, hey, let's stick to the topic. Let's stay focused on exactly what we're supposed to be talking about within this executive session.
I just wanted to make mention of the fact that I also sit on constitutionally required boards. And it is incumbent upon me as an individual in a couple of different capacities to see that we comply with that requirement. First of all, as a member of the board, say the Board of Land Commissioners, I have an obligation to speak up when we're in executive session and we begin to drift. And I have done that before. Sometimes to the distress of other members of the board. But the answer is, I am obligated to do that, and you are obligated to do that. I also have an obligation as the attorney for the board. Actually, I have an assigned person. Your attorney has to be authorized to speak up and say, we've drifted too far. We've got to put ourselves back in line. And so part of what your obligation is to clearly communicate that to your lawyer so that she knows she can speak up. And then each of you have that same obligation. And you know when you're drifting. You know when you're drifting, and you have an obligation to stand up and say something. It's not always fun. It's not always easy. It can cause disruption in communication. But the answer is, that is how narrowly defined and confined that executive session is and must be. And I have had to do it. And it's not always a pleasant thing. People kind of rib you and not too happy about it. But the answer is, that's the way we have to communicate. So I didn't mean to disrupt Brian, but I wanted you to know that we have experienced precisely what we're talking about and understand that perspective.
Attorney General Wasden, so I don't understand your comment about that we have to authorize our attorney to say something. Isn't that what they're there for?
Absolutely, and I'm not saying that what I'm trying to explain to you is create the atmosphere where that attorney knows and understands and will speak up, okay? And she is authorized to speak up, and we expect that of our attorneys. We don't cut any corners in that regard. But I'm also trying to say to you that each of you, every one of you, has that same obligation. It's not the attorney's role alone. Attorney certainly has an obligation to do that, sitting as an observer, and has that duty and obligation. But every one of you have that obligation as well.
Other questions on the exceptions? And so I don't know if you ever engaged in this, but you also have the same exception with regard to risk management issues, where your public agency's risk management or insurance provider can come in and discuss a pending claim, meaning a claim that's already been made, or one that's likely to be filed. And again, you want to be able to identify with specificity, this is the claim we're discussing, or this is the likely claim that we're discussing within this session. And I think that, as you think through each of these executive session exceptions, there is always a specific something that you should be able to point to for purposes of the discussion. Anytime you bleed over to general, that should be a cautionary tale. We're either improperly in executive session, or it's time for us to return to the topic and focus back in. And I will be more than honest with you. It is really easy to drift within an executive session. And I'll give you an example that happened probably about 3, 4, 5 years ago. There was an executive session. They were in there properly to fill a staffing vacancy. And as they were filling it, the person presenting in the executive session said, well, this will fill one of the 5 vacancies that we have within our organization. And someone said, well, wait a minute, why do we have so many vacancies within the organization? And you can probably start to see what's happening here. And the person said, well, we haven't really had the funds to fill the vacancies for some time. Well, why haven't we had the funds? And do you see what's happened? Are they at this point any longer discussing that vacancy? And yet those are really kind of predictable questions. And yet they're the types of questions that shouldn't be brought up within that executive session. And so that shows you just how easy at times it can be to drift. So the exceptions to the general policy in favor of open meetings shall be narrowly construed. And so again, I keep kind of talking about the specificity element, but it's because the statute says we're going to construe these exceptions narrowly. And it's very clear out there. It's a violation of the act to change the subject within the executive session to one not identified within the motion to enter the executive session or to any topic for which an executive session is not provided. And so here you can kind of see the precise statutory basis for some of the alleged violations that we noted to you all as the commission. And so again, that reinforces why it's so important for folks to be able to say, hey, let's get back on topic.
Mr. King,
Yes.
so going back to the example that you gave, you're having this discussion, and you get a question in your mind, you jot it down on a piece of paper, does that become public record, what you jotted down? Can somebody get a public records request for something you jotted down on a piece of paper?
So that is a public records question, not an open meeting question, so I just want to make sure we're talking in the correct statutes. And the answer is yes. Unless there's an exemption from disclosure for some reason, notes are considered public records. And we actually have a couple of cases referred to in the back of our public records manual. And I think in one of the cases, somebody was making notes on the way that folks were dressed when they showed up for public comment. And those all became public records. And so that's one of those things to just be aware of, is that notes can be a public record if some other exemption doesn't apply.
He had to remove his comment about his purple tie.
No executive session can be held for the purpose of taking any final action or making any final decision. And again, this is why my recommendation is that if you go into an executive session and you think you're going to have to make a decision afterwards, make sure you identify that on your agenda as a potential action item. You can't make it within this session. Now, one of the questions that we get sometimes, we get two questions. One is, if we can't make a final decision, but we're like talking to our attorney about settling a case or something, how do we do that? Well, you kind of know when you reach consensus, and you absolutely can come out of the executive session and have a motion to adopt the attorney's recommendation. And you haven't given away what that is. And so, for example, if Becky were to come to you in executive session and say, I think we can resolve this case for between $50,000 and $100,000. And you all had your discussion, and you said, 50 sounds a lot better than 100. I hope we get there instead of 100, but we're okay generally with it. You can move out and adopt that recommendation. If you were to come out of the executive session and say, I move that we settle this case for between 50 and 100,000, guess what the low number becomes, right? And so you can kind of see how this works together. And then the second question that we always get is, well, how do we know when an executive session is over? And I always I use two things to kind of identify when an executive session is kind of winding down. One, people start repeating themselves, right? You start hearing the same thing over and over, and you're like, all right, guys, I think the horse is dead. Let's get out of here. And then the other thing is, you can kind of see when a consensus is starting to be gained. And then you can say, hey, I think we're ready to take action. Do you want to go back out into open session? And I think those are two kind of really indicative elements that can help you say, all right, this executive session is done. The third is your watch, right? If the executive session starts to get long, it's time to get out. And I think that, if you go back to the purpose of the executive session is confidentiality, you want to limit them in number of attendees and limit them in the amount of time. That becomes a great marker as well. Minutes pertaining to executive sessions shall include a reference to the specific statutory subsection authorizing the executive session and provide sufficient detail to identify the purpose and topic, but not contain information sufficient to compromise the purpose. And so your minutes are going to be very brief, right? We went into, the board went into an executive session and discussed matters regarding the disciplinary issue of student X or whatever. But that's all it's going to say. And you don't give away anything within those minutes. The public, I will tell you, finds those frustrating, but that's what the law requires. I would recommend that for all of your executive sessions, within the minutes, you include the time that you went into the executive session and the time that you came out of the executive session. And I would further advise, if you go into an executive session for more than one purpose, so say you go into an executive session to consider the hiring of an employee, and you're also in the executive session to receive legal advice on pending litigation. Within your minutes, indicate at 9 o'clock went into executive session to consider the hiring of position X. At 9:15, discussion of the hiring ended. 9:16, discussion with legal counsel commenced. 9:31, discussion with legal counsel ended, executive session adjourned. And the reason for why that's important, why I recommend that, is it allows the public to kind of have a running diary of what's going on in that executive session. And so as an external observer, you can say, they discussed this hiring for about 15 minutes. That seems fairly reasonable. Then they talk to their attorney for another 15, 20 minutes. That also seems entirely reasonable. And it allows you to inject confidence into your proceedings, right? We're efficiently considering these issues. And so that's not an open meeting law requirement, but that's a recommendation that I would make to you all to think about how you can better put that out to the public.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. I have someplace else I have to be, but I wanted to talk with you for just a moment about cure provisions and let you know that I have personally experienced cure provisions a number of years ago. You're going to get to this later, but I wanted to at least let you know that I have done what you are doing. We were in a meeting, a land board meeting in Coeur d'Alene. I asked at the outset of the meeting whether it had been properly noticed. I was assured by the staff that it had been properly noticed. Had it not been properly noticed, I would not have participated in the meeting. However, I was informed that it had been given proper notice. We went into the meeting, held the entire meeting. The next morning, I got a phone call here in Boise, and they said, oh, by the way, we told you that it was properly noticed. It wasn't. So that means that we had now learned that we had all participated in an illegal meeting. That's doubly difficult for me as the Attorney General because I statutorily have the responsibility of enforcing the open meeting law against public entities, such as the land board. So that means that I, as the enforcer, have now participated in an illegal meeting. I called Brian, said, this is the situation, and he gave me great advice, things that I already knew. And we had to redo the entire meeting. And not only did we redo the entire meeting, including all of the motions, all of the seconds, all of the votes, recording that all, we took the minutes from our illegal meeting and we put them into the minutes of the legal meeting so that the entire world knew that we had held an illegal meeting. And I will let you discuss with Brian the outcome of our action. It's kind of interesting how it came about. So I apologize for jumping forward in your training, but I have to leave, and I wanted to make certain that you knew that I think what you're doing is important, and it's important to have this conversation, that I have experienced the very things that you have experienced. And so I wanted to let you know that, and I appreciate your question, Mr. Chairman, and our attorney is authorized to interrupt in that regard. As I said, all of you have that obligation. At the same time, to create an atmosphere among this organization that you do have the ability to step out front and say something. That's what I was trying to address with you. You have to create that culture, and that's what I'm hoping that you will do. So thank you very much. I'm sorry, I've got other things I must attend to, and I hope you're getting what you need to from Brian. Thank you.
Thanks for your time.
Okay, so any other questions on executive sessions?
One question, if someone chooses to call, if someone is wanting to call into the executive session, you have no way of knowing how many people are at the other end of the line. Is that allowable?
So it's allowable, but you have your own caution within your question, right? You have
Right.
no idea who else is on the line or if it's on speakerphone and so that's a determination for the board to make. The board makes the rules for who is in their executive session and how they're attended.
What's your guidance?
So this is why people don't invite me many places. It depends. And I think, and it depends because it depends on what the purpose of the executive session is, right? If I'm having an executive session that involves a complaint with somebody, and I want to interview them, well, it's very possible that they're not going to want to agree to the interview unless like they have their counsel present. And so I may be in a situation as a board where we have to say, you know what, we're going to let you attend by telephone, and we're going to just do it with the understanding that there's probably going to be other people in the room based on this. And I mean, to me, it's a situation where you want to kind of be eyes wide open. And if you do get that sort of request, that's a really good time to say, hey, I want to talk to the executive director. I want to talk to our attorney. I want to make sure we all know what the hazards are before we agree to this.
Thank you.
Other questions on executive sessions? Okay, you can breathe out. We've made it to enforcement. And just so you know, enforcement, failure to comply renders the action null. And I want to make sure that you know that that's something that doesn't just happen automatically. Like I don't just jump up and say you violated the open meeting law. What you did is meaningless at this point. Somebody has to kind of order it. And I know that folks kind of ask questions about why we had a notice of alleged open meeting violation and didn't just call it a violation. And it's because we're the investigator and prosecutor on an open meeting violation. So if you had said, we're not going to agree with you, Office of Attorney General, we would have gone to court. And then it would have been up to a judge to say, yes, you violated it, or no, you didn't. AG, you're being too technical with the law, and this isn't really a violation. That's why ours only said notice of alleged, right? We don't make rulings, we don't have orders. This is the process. And so you all enacted the cure provision, which enables you upon notice of a potential violation, which is what you were given through our office, to cure it at that point. Any member who participates in a meeting is subject to a civil penalty. Any violation is up to $250, $1,500 for a knowing participated. And I want to turn your attention to the last one, which is $2,500 if subsequent to a previous violation within the last 12 months. And so you have to be aware of that repeat violation concern being out there. These penalties are payable by the individual board member, meaning the commission can't come in and pay these fines. They come directly out of your wallet. And so if you are lacking in incentives to comply with the open meeting law, know that these penalties come directly to you, the person. With regard to enforcement, our office enforces it regarding public agencies of state government. Prosecuting attorneys do it with regard to local agencies of government. And then any person affected by a violation can commence a civil action. And so they have 180 days to commence that civil action. You can cure a violation, and you have a couple of ways to do it. You can self-recognize and say, hey, we messed up, and cure it. you can receive a written notice of an alleged violation, and then you have 14 days. That's why that 14 days was within your notice to either say, yes, we messed up and we want to cure it, or we don't agree with you. And that's just to kind of keep the process moving along. Following your acknowledgement, you have 14 days to cure the violation by declaring all actions taken or resulting from the meeting in violation of the act void, which was part of what you did earlier. And then all enforcement actions are stayed, and the cure is a bar to the imposition of the civil penalty. And so by curing the violation, you kind of protected yourselves from the enforcement provisions within the act. And I think this is a really good example of how those cure provisions work with the enforcement provisions. This is a quick chart of the cure process and the different ways that you can get to. And just so you know, just because somebody says that you violated the open meeting law doesn't necessarily mean that you have. You may review it and say, look, we did everything according to the law, and there is no violation. That is one of the outcomes of a notice of violation. I also wanted to let you know that for organizational purposes, we include a series of checklists with our manual. And so we have a checklist for just regular meetings, a checklist for special meetings, a checklist for executive sessions, an executive session motion and order if you need it, how to amend the agenda if that's necessary. And so it kind of walks you through each one of those steps. And for example, you may be wondering, well, does anybody use these checklists? And the answer is yes, the land board actually uses the regular meeting checklist for every one of their meetings, and as does the Board of Examiners. One of my responsibilities is to actually review the open meetings checklist for the Board of Examiners meeting before I hand the binder over to the boss. And I always have my fingers crossed when I get it that all the boxes are checked. But I think that, those little things, I know that they sound maybe a little bit bureaucratic and cumbersome, but they really deliver a healthy dose of prevention in these sorts of situations. And like I said at the very beginning, the goal of this law is compliance. And I think that part of the recognition of this law is that folks don't come to government as experts in things like the open meeting law or public records law. And so we have things like the cure provision because we know that as volunteers and non-experts, things aren't always going to go perfectly. And this gives you the ability to learn and to comply as opposed to having a hammer kind of over your heads. The final point I always like to make with the open meeting law is the open meeting law it's intended to allow the public to observe government in action. It's not intended to allow the government or to allow folks to participate in government. And so the open meeting law is only a ticket to the show being government. It is not their ability to jump up onto the stage and sing along with the cast of Hamilton. And I think that that's one of those things that I always like to let folks know because we get a lot of phone calls in our office. I went to the public meeting and they didn't let me speak. And the answer is they don't have to. Now, if you have an open forum like you did this morning, yes, you probably want to let all comers say their piece and you're perfectly authorized to limit it to 3 minutes or 4 minutes apiece, all permissible things. But you don't have to have an open forum. That is not an open meeting law requirement. That's a political question for the commission to consider. With that, I'd be happy to stand for any questions. I also recognize I'm probably between you all and lunch, so.
Well, I do want to thank you.
I don't want to bear the brunt of your hanger.
I do want to thank you. And I think this was a wonderful, in my case, refresher, because I saw you in Coeur d'Alene when you did the tour around the state, and feel badly we were in this situation and appreciate your guidance.
Thank you.
To prevent it again.
Thank you. And just so you all know, our office will be doing the full open government presentation in Nampa Boise and McCall this fall. And so for folks on the phone that want to, or if we're in your neighborhood, come out. That goes all the way through the open meetings law and the public records law. And we do it in conjunction with Idahoans for Open Government and the Idaho Press Club. And those are great events because it brings everyone together, elected officials, the press, and constituencies. So everyone gets the same information, everyone gets to ask questions and hear the answers. And so if you have the opportunity, I wholeheartely endorse it.
So how will we know when and where that is?
We'll put that notice out. We're still kind of negotiating dates. As you can imagine, a couple of calendars are a little trickier than others.
Yeah. Thanks for your flexibility of being able to come today. It was very kind of you.
Sure, happy to, and I really appreciate the professionalism with which you all have approached this situation. As I noted at the beginning, it is a difficult situation for all of us involved. I will tell you that I do not like receiving these phone calls, but I also understand that the work of government has to go on, and we have to do it in a way that injects confidence into our processes. So thank you for your professionalism.
Mr. Chair.
Yes, please.
This is maybe more of a comment than a question, but we obviously encourage the school boards that we supervise that they should go through training. We do various kinds of professional learning, and today was a particular topic. The challenge is boards have revolving memberships. Memberships change at various times for various both terms ending and resignations or whatever. Any recommendations as to how we would advise our advisees to keep the board's training current?
Number one, I think that that's a great recommendation to come from the commission, right? That you need to keep up on training. And maybe you have specific areas that you identify of those. Our office has a very good relationship with the Idaho School Boards Association. And I actually just submitted, I don't know if they're going to approve it or not, but to do a workshop on the open meetings law at the Idaho School Boards Association meeting this fall. And additionally, you can even tell your school boards to call our office. We will make ourselves available to do the training in just about any topic, right? Open record or public records, open meetings law, ethics in government, maybe some of the intricacies of public contracting. It gets a little tricky the deeper we go because they have their own council, and sometimes the council wants to do that training. But the key is to encourage that training and to make sure that they understand that within government, they're fulfilling a role as a public trustee, right? The public has entrusted to them their representation on these issues. And so to fulfill that trusteeship, this training is an element of that, to stay abreast of the law and the requirements. It's part of the duty of care. Thank you. Thank you.
Make a motion to adjourn.
Do we have a motion to adjourn? Is there a second?
I'll make the second.
Any further discussion? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you.
Public service. Idaho Cable Broadband Association, University of Idaho James A. and Louise